Let's bring in NBC News chief foreign correspondent Richard Engel in Haifa, Israel. Also with us, former senior advisor at the Department of Defense and a former Green Beret, Jason Beardsley, and former State Department senior advisor Nayyera Haq. Let's start with you, Richard. Lebanese authorities say 182 people have now been killed in these strikes. We've seen those numbers continue to go up over the course of the morning here. How much of an escalation are these strikes from what we've seen previously?
We're seeing a dramatic escalation, and it began last week with the attacks that targeted thousands of Hezbollah operatives' pagers and then walkie-talkies, an attack that could only have been carried out by Israel. And now Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu is sort of hinting that Israel was responsible, although Israel hasn't officially accepted responsibility. Prime Minister Netanyahu said that Hezbollah understood Israel's capabilities with an attack that it hadn't expected, and if it didn't get the message, it will get the message. I'm paraphrasing, but that's what Netanyahu was saying, clearly suggesting that Israel was behind that attack on the command and control structure. And then after that, since yesterday and then all day today so far, there have been strikes, rolling strikes on what are being described as Hezbollah military sites, sites where rockets are launched, a site that was used, according to the Israeli military, to launch a cruise missile. And it seems that Israel is trying to first take out the Hezbollah communication network. Then there was a strike on Beirut that apparently targeted, and you may have just heard an explosion, and a second one here, and a third, a series of explosions now that are consistent with Israel's Iron Dome system. Actually, it is the Iron Dome system. If you look behind me, and it might be difficult to see with the contrast here is very bright where outside, and it's a little darker where I am. But you can see the puffs of smoke in the air. Clearly, Israel is firing at something with fairly intense volleys of the Iron Dome system. It's unclear if these are incoming missiles or more likely drones, because I didn't hear any incoming fire. We are in the city of Haifa, which is in northern Israel. This is a city that Hezbollah has said it intends to target, it wants to target. We're right by the port in Haifa, which is a target that that Hezbollah has indicated it is of something of interest to Hezbollah. So we are definitely seeing this conflict moving into northern Israel. So it is not just the Israelis are attacking mostly southern Lebanon, but also the Bekaa Valley. So to go back to your original question, this is a dramatic escalation. Will this spill into a full-on regional war, a full-on ground war? I think that depends on what Hezbollah does over the next several days. But we're certainly seeing an escalation here, and a war between Hezbollah and Israel is underway, without a doubt.
Well, please stay safe, Richard, and thank you for bringing us the very latest. Keep us posted as we go throughout this hour. And as Richard mentioned, Jason, there's been now an exchange of these strikes. We're hearing about the strikes happening in southern Lebanon, and then we're seeing with our own eyes this morning some return strikes, it sounds like, coming from Lebanon into Israel. We know over the weekend Hezbollah launched 150 rockets, missiles, drones at Israel. Most of those were captured by the Iron Dome. A few resulted in some shrapnel wounds of a few civilians. But now we have this first-of-a-kind warning from Israel to Lebanese civilians to get out. What does that suggest to you about the scope of these strikes?
Well, that's really suggestive that their intent here is very clear. They have established the groundwork for decapitating the leadership of Hezbollah, and they've done that through successive covert actions. And now they are using overt actions to tell the population, if you are in these areas hiding nested ammunition depots, or you are in vicinity of Hezbollah known targets, this is the warning to go ahead and leave those areas. And the population here, we have to understand the host populations of these societies do not necessarily want to be part of this escalation. And so Israel is attempting to say this is the time to leave, because the strikes are going to continue. you a lot of the ammunition, the equipment that is used to, excuse me, launch rockets into northern Israel is done in this southern Lebanese area. There's a lot of mountains. There's a lot of regions for them to hide this stuff. But a lot of times they'll co-locate ammunition by civilian targets under schools or near hospitals. And this then drives a wedge between Hezbollah and the population. That's part of what Israel is saying. So it's a very purposeful part of the psychological operation that Israel is laying down in front of what we're likely to see over the next escalation days, if you will.
Nayera, the U.S. and other allies have been calling for de-escalation, frankly, for months now. Here was National Security spokesman John Kirby just this weekend.
We don't believe that a military conflict, and we're saying this directly to our Israeli counterparts, George, we don't believe that escalating this military conflict is in their best interest. It's certainly not going to be in the best interest of all those people that Prime Minister Netanyahu says he wants to be able to send back home.
So President Biden and Netanyahu are among the dozens of leaders here in New York for the UN General Assembly this week. Nayera, could that maybe in-person diplomacy help that message we just heard get through?
Well, that would assume that Netanyahu actually valued the perspective of the United States to the degree that we would hope, given the United States support for Israeli defense. What we have seen over the course of the last year as Israel continues to escalate, not only in Gaza and West Bank and now in Lebanon, is that Netanyahu has an agenda of, in his perspective, getting rid of the terrorist groups that have threatened Israel for decades, and doing so by being very aggressive and forward-leaning, despite warnings from allies that they have limits. Now, we have not seen yet what that limit would look like from the United States, and Biden and others have continued to say that they will come to the defense of Israel. But Netanyahu's actions raise that big question of, what does that defense of Israel look like when Israel is the one being the aggressor? And that's going to fundamentally be the challenge here, particularly when it comes to Israel warning another country to evacuate civilians. Now, ostensibly, that is to, as my colleague said, to drive that psychological wedge. But it is also Israel giving itself cover to say that the civilian casualties that may happen should not have happened because people were told to leave. Where are people supposed to go, right? The increasing refugee crisis is a global challenge being discussed at the United Nations this week. And now we have an increasing refugee crisis on Israel's borders as well.
Jason, Hezbollah's deputy chief says they are now in a phase of open-ended reckoning. And I'm wondering, as we've spent all these months covering more specifically the war against Hamas in Gaza, how would a war with Hezbollah compare to what we've seen in Gaza?
Yeah, well, it compares in kind of different ways. Hamas in Gaza, that's very urban terrain. It's a lot of combat that is very difficult to do. What's different about Hezbollah, and I think it's very important to understand, I represent veterans from Concerned Veterans for America. We have American soldiers in Iraq and Syria that are nestled amongst the populations that are also being fronted by popular mobilization forces that are run out of Iran. And these are proxies that have a beef or a grind with the West. And so our soldiers right now on the ground are vulnerable there. And I think the president, I think the White House can do a little bit better by giving advantage to the United States military troops that are in harm's way. The actual war that might happen with or that's ongoing between Israel and Hezbollah is playing out in the manner you're seeing. A lot of covert action, a lot of overt action. But what ends up happening is, as our colleague also mentioned, is that the populations here are being harassed both by the Hezbollah and by the rockets, the incoming fire from Israel. So there has to be a decision made by people who are hosting these Hezbollah terror networks on how far they're willing to abide by this back and forth that we've seen for years. I think it's worth noting that Israel did a lot of work to try to target selectively Hezbollah leaders. We saw Ibrahim Akil finally killed. This is the man who is responsible for 243 Marines that were killed in Beirut in '93. So this is part and parcel of a long, enduring campaign. But the problem with going after Hezbollah proper is they have networks in Yemen, they have them in Israel, they have them in Syria, they have them in Iraq, they have them, of course, in Lebanon. So these have to be carefully conducted, and that's part of what you're seeing is if Israel can take out the ammunition depots, they reduce the risk for the populations in places like Haifa, where your colleague Richard Engel is reporting. So this is not going to go away soon.